and thank you for joining us. My name is Jennifer Hill, and I'm a biologist at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's National Conservation Training Center. Prior to introducing our guest speakers, I would like to highlight that in keeping with the mission of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to protect habitats and connect people with nature, the National Conservation Training Center acknowledges that it sits on the ancestral lands of many Native nations. Several Indigenous people stewarded these lands near Shepherdstown, West Virginia, or traversed this area during forceful removal. These include, but are not limited to, the Iroquois Confederacy, the Shawnee, and the Delaware. However, the Massachusetts Nation was the most prominent of the people in this area. As we have learned more about the Indigenous peoples who had relationships with these lands before us, we better appreciate the soil on which we work, live, and learn. And for this, we give our deepest thanks to the ones that came before. We encourage others to learn more about the land on which they work and reside, as it is on these lands that we are able to connect the continuing education of service employees and our partners. At any time during the presentation, should you have questions, please enter them into the chat or email them to broadcast@fws.gov. Today, we are going to hear about developing land acknowledgements from Crystal Leonetti and Melissa Shaginoff. First off, we'll hear about Crystal, who will then introduce Melissa. Alaska has been home to Crystal and her family for many generations. On her mother's side in the Bristol Bay region with Yupik ancestry, and on her father's side as homesteaders coming from Texas in the 1940s. She grew up on a small farm with her parents and 3 siblings. Crystal went to college at the University of Idaho, hoping to become a high school teacher. She earned her Bachelor of Science degree in agricultural education in 2000 and returned to Alaska to pursue a natural resources career at the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Natural Resources Conservation Service, a federal agency that helps private landowners apply conservation practices on their land. In August of 2010, Crystal began her job at the United States Fish and Wildlife Service as the Alaska Native Affairs Specialist. In her capacity there, she represents the Regional Director in Alaska Native Interests and coordinates and trains employees on the regional government-to-government relations with Alaska's federally recognized tribes. Thank you, Crystal, for joining us today. I'll now hand it over to you to introduce Melissa.
Ciisquq. I said in my Yupik language, "What's up?" My name is Ciisquq. My Yupik name was given to me in the traditional way by my grandparents, Daisy and the late Harry Barnes Sr. from Chickaloon, Alaska. I'm coming to you today from Nay'dini'aa, translated into English as Mouth of the Needlefish. Nay'dini'aa is now known as Anchorage, Alaska. Dene, Ahtna. These are the traditional homelands and unceded territory of the Nay'dini'aa people. My husband Ed and I feel honored to raise our family here in this beautiful place, which has been stewarded by the Nay'dini'aa people for a very long time before outsiders arrived. The Nay'dini'aa people have lived here in times of abundance, times of shortage, times of war, and times of love. Their bones are in the soil. To this day, Nay'dini'aa people are leaders and remain stewards of the beautiful land. I'm thankful for their leadership, past, present, and future. I'm really excited and honored to be with you today. Thank you to Jennifer Hill and the National Conservation Training Center for offering the Tribal Broadcast Series. I think they deserve a high 25, if that's possible. Now I have the pleasure of introducing you to someone really special. She does it all, and she does it with grace and love. Melissa Shaginoff is part of the Udzisyu, or caribou, and Cui Ui Ticutta, or fish eater clans, from Nay'dini'aa Na, or Chickaloon Village, Alaska. She is Ahtna and Paiute, an artist, a social activist, and the curator of Alaska Pacific University's art galleries. Her work is shaped by the structure and processes of the Dene ceremonies of potlatch. She has been published in the Alaska Humanities FORUM Magazine, First American Art Magazine, Inuit Art Quarterly, and the Smithsonian Arctic Studies Center Learning Lab. She teaches about land acknowledgement concepts and other Indigenous leadership attributes. So with that, Melissa, take it away.
Shanann, Willie Jan, and Sarote, Melissa Shagnos, the Setlan, Idishios Koikara Etlan, Nay'dini'aa Na Kayax and Siaden. Shanann, so much, Crystal, for bringing me into this work. This last year, I've done a few different trainings and workshops on land acknowledgement with the Fish and Wildlife Service. And, considering its history in Alaska, it's really important to me and important to be in communication and relationship, with an agency that has worked with Indigenous people in many capacities. So I'm just really honored to be here today to share sort of my thoughts on it and talk about how we can, move forward. Because many of our institutions, including, agencies such as Fish and Wildlife Service, have many levels of colonialism, within its systemic sort of structures. So it's important to address these things now and recognize where we're starting and what we can do in the future. So I just want to say Shanann again for having me here. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and share the presentation, and we'll get going. All right. So you are on Indigenous land. Everywhere in North America is an Indigenous place, and it's been stewarded for thousands of years by Indigenous people. And recognizing that is a way that we can start countering sort of colonial falsehoods of the wild and frontier. And specifically in Alaska, that's what I've experienced is kind of this sort of false narrative that this place, was this new place when at contact with non-Native people. But the truth is, it's always been an Indigenous place, and it's always been touched and cared for and stewarded. But we're going to get a little bit more into that. So as part of the structure, so I have a little intro. Let me move it. Intro slide. This is me. This is where I'm from Nay'dini'aa Na, or Chickaloon Village, what we call the log over the river. This is going up the road that I took just a couple days ago, going to hide camp to work on some moose hides with my aunties. So this is around Eureka area, so in Ahtna territory, just a little bit north. This is also my contact information if you'd like to take a screenshot or write it down. Yeah, we'll keep going. So if you could, in the chat, to be able to share it with each other, later, I'd like you to introduce yourself. And, hopefully this will be something that I'll be able to see later. Part of land acknowledgement, I think, is kind of introducing who you are and your intentions. And growing up, that was the first thing I learned, that if you're going to learn your language, the first thing you need to learn is how to introduce yourself, how to set the sort of stage and kind of let people know where you're coming from and who you're responsible towards. So yeah, if these are a few questions that you wouldn't mind putting into the chat, and hopefully we'll be able to see that with each other at a later time. But who you are, where you're from, and what you do, and do you know whose Indigenous land you're on? All right, so we'll keep going. I want to recognize kind of who brought me here, because that's another really important part of my culture, and I would say, pretty much across Alaska, a really important part of all Indigenous cultures, is that it recognizing your teachers and who brought you there. So I want to say Chickaloon to my teachers, Sonia Kelleher Combs and Emily Johnson, who are two artists who taught me a lot about what does it mean to be an Indigenous culture bearer and artist, and the sort of weight that holds, but also the possibilities. Growing up, I didn't really have role models like that, and they really kind of took me under their wing and showed me, what an artistic Indigenous life can be. And I just really appreciate them for that. They're also two amazing artists if you look them up, Emily Johnson and Sonia Kelleher Combs. I also want to recognize Jeannie Maxim, who is my elder, who's been teaching my language and, through recording, still teaching me. She passed away this last year. And, I just really want to recognize her, particularly whenever I use my language. So Chickaloon to them. Now we'll go to our first question. And this is another one that we'll address in the chat after, which is, what does land acknowledgement actually acknowledge? So the structure of this workshop, I created it when I was a museum curator. And it was really kind of out of this desire to really see land acknowledgements become more commonplace in Alaska. And this happened because I had gone to a conference in Canada, and part of their truth and reconciliation policy, government policy, is to do land acknowledgements. And I didn't realize at that conference how much it would mean to me, hearing a land acknowledgement over and over again, and it made me sort of like see kind of the potential land acknowledgements can have for your audience. But then also it kind of made me be a bit more critical as to what they're actually doing, right? Because land acknowledgement is just words, right? And so it's like, how do we use land acknowledgement as a way to sort of strategize our personal reparations and our institutional reparations? How are we offering healing and equity in land acknowledgement? Did folks, I'm not seeing that in there, Jen, so I don't know if I have access to seeing where people are from, but I know that after the fact, we talked about being able to see that. But yeah, if anybody would go ahead and type where they're from and what they do, and if they've ever heard a land acknowledgement before, that would be great. I know it's a lot to transfer, but yes, sorry about that. But we'll go ahead and keep going. This sort of word, I think, this sort of question, I think, is something that we'll revisit towards the end. A lot of the teaching that I do, and the reason why I do this workshop is because it's really about sort of your personal work to be done. I think that, I could sit here and tell you like what land acknowledgement is and sort of the breakdown of the 101, and I will. But I also think that it's important to kind of do some self-reflection and ask yourself questions. So even if I can't see your answers, I think it's a really important thing just to ask yourself these things. Because as you start to ask yourself those questions, interrogate your own sort of beliefs and knowledge, you're going to be able to start seeing where the holes are and what kind of work you need to be doing forward. But yeah, we'll keep going. So the first little bit of content I have is a video, and it's just a short video, but it was created by the U.S. Department of Arts and Cultures, and I think is like a really great way to start kind of like your land acknowledgement work and journey, essentially, because it shouldn't stop with just your statement. All right. And please let me know, team, if you can't hear things. I have everything turned up, so we'll keep going.
Before I begin this morning, I'd like to recognize the Algonquin Nation, on whose traditional territory we are gathering. We acknowledge them as the past, present, and future caretakers of this land.
Oh, sorry about that. I can't click my screen at all, or else I'll pause it. Okay.
Wherever I go on God's green earth, I do the Lakota tradition of acknowledging the four directions, the land, and the people living there. Chimaka, as I call Grandmother Earth, the land, I view her as a sacred, living entity, and that's the way we acknowledge it in, Lakota thought and philosophy.
As a Native person, I'm ready for any kind of confrontation that might come up, or I'm preparing myself to remind people of all those things that they forget about. I was at a meeting in Minneapolis, and the room was primarily non-Native people. I was in a non-Native organization, but this executive director got up and said, okay, we're going to get started. So everybody, was sitting down and getting quiet. And she said, I'd like to get started by acknowledging the Indigenous culture of Minnesota. And I was like, wow. And it just made everything fall away a little bit from me. My guard went down. I was more relaxed because by saying that, that means she understands something that is just you can't talk about, right? It just relaxed me as a minority, as a woman, and as a Native person. It just pulled away this layer that's always there. It was super cool.
We're at a time where non-Native cultures are understanding the traditions of Indigenous peoples for probably the first time in our histories. So when I go to New Zealand, the protocol is to acknowledge each other's ancestors and your mountains and your rivers. And that's such a beautiful tradition. When people are in that space and say, we acknowledge who you are, this land, where your people come from, they're saying we acknowledge your relationship, but we're also creating that relationship. This is a good thing.
The important thing would be that folks would then sit with that. What does it mean that our settlement is occupying this space? And what responsibility do I have considering that legacy to these contemporary things, right? And how do I stop distancing myself from that? Ideally, that would be, for me, the impact that this has.
If you start acknowledging that the land that you're standing on and the space that you are in belong to people that are still here, make so much more room for understanding of all these other issues. It's one of those little things that if it could just tip a little bit, all the dominoes that could fall from it, I think are important.
Now I'm imagining it and wanting to live in that, the thing that I'm imagining, yeah, that's actually really beautiful.
It's just being a genuine human being to acknowledge each other's histories, the good and the bad.
So I like to let that whole sort of the credits run through because I really want to recognize this organization. It's really a really wonderful sort of organizing agency and arts agency that does a lot of guides and a lot of teaching sort of moments. And it's really where I started kind of learning about land acknowledgements and how I could, teach them in Alaska. The guide Honoring Native Land, which is on their website, is a really wonderful start. I will say it doesn't sort of follow or doesn't address the North in Alaska. When we look at sort of federally recognized tribes, 530 or so are in the state or altogether in the whole country. And then over half of them, 239 or something, are in Alaska. And that's a really important sort of, cultures to be addressed and included in those kind of things. So I created my own guide. If you look on my website, you can find a guide that also has all the clickable links to things that I learned So I'll make sure that that's given to Crystal and can be shared with people who need. Thank you so much, Doug, for putting in the info into the chat. I've catched a few of people introductions, and I appreciate that. But yeah, we're going to go into kind of what land acknowledgement is, and kind of the sort of structure. So what is land acknowledgement? This was the question I was asked when I started doing this work, a lot, right? Because I think that in some ways, land acknowledgement can be really over intellectualized, that it can sort of think, oh, well, it's about being grateful, but then it's about, being grateful to everybody and all these things. And I was like, okay, I can understand where you're going with that. But at the same time, first and foremost, land acknowledgement is about recognizing Indigenous people in their stewardship, in their work, and their history. And considering the history of the world and the history of these places, in Alaska, our oldest, just according to archaeological record, oldest sort of site, of Dene people, I believe they're called ancient Beringians, but in the anthropological sense, but truly Dene people, Athabascan people, is 17,000 years old. And that's, when you look at the timeline of the world, I'm sure I don't have to tell anybody here, that's before the pyramids, that's before any sort of form of written language. That's the things that we consider ancient in our history of sort of Western civilization. That's a really ancient thing. And it's truly sort of a history that is about stewardship and relationship with this place. And really the only sustainable culture that has been here within Alaska. So I think that in some ways land acknowledgement is a moment for you to counter those sort of narratives that erase us from the history, right? I call it countering colonial falsehoods, particularly ones that perpetuate the Western romanticism of land and wild. For those of you in Alaska and others, we hear Alaska as being the last frontier, right? This great, wild, untouched place. And those are truly just false narratives. They're just a fallacy, because there's no part of Alaska that is able to be defined as a frontier. Frontier, is erases Indigenous stewardship and Indigenous work and the interaction that we've had with this place for so long, and it's really important for us to use things like land acknowledgements to sort of counter those arguments, right? And I like to call it, sharing the sort of burden of truth. I think that me being here and my power and privilege and sharing these things with you, is kind of like me offering it to you and asking you to continue that sort of sharing, right? Because then it's no longer just on my shoulders. It's no longer just on Crystal's shoulders, right? And for so long since contact, it's always been on Indigenous shoulders to talk the truth about things, to speak the truth about this place, because we were just constantly erased from our own land, and it's really important to sort of, I think, use land acknowledgement as a moment to share that history, and in allyship, share some of this burden of truth, So I also think land acknowledgement is a way to kind of open a space, open a station with your intentions, which is about, hopefully, in this day and age, about equity and about bringing everybody in and about having sort of collective decision making, on land, on all these things. And land acknowledgements can be a good way to sort of open the door. I spoke, and much like the speaker in the video, Mary Bardot, talked about going to a conference, like I went to a conference and hearing the sort of director stand up and give a land acknowledgement, how that kind of made everything fall away for her. And that's the same sort of experience I had. I sort of let out this sort of breath of air that I was, this breath I was holding in, and just kind of like let it go, because, all the things that I was holding kind of like on my shoulders as being, at least coded the only Indigenous person that I recognized, and feeling like the only Indigenous person in that room, I thought, maybe that person, maybe that executive director, that leader considers me and the work that they do, considers my family and the work that they do, and of course it wasn't action. It wasn't, really the proof, of that person thought those things. But it opened a door for me to feel more comfortable in that space, and also emboldened me, to really kind of look at that work as, this is something that I can be doing. This is something that I can be changing, and emboldened me to ask questions of that person, and to essentially start a relationship with them where there was no relationship before, and I'm it's funny that I say that, because I'm going to be doing a residency there in that organization, because of that relationship that started that time. Land acknowledgement is also an opportunity to share information about the sustainable technologies of Indigenous people. I think that when we hear technology, we think of it, as really kind of like the future. But I think in many ways, we need to remember forward, remember the past and the way Indigenous people have managed the land. And I know that many stations in the Fish and Wildlife Service does this, but I think that we have to continue to remind ourselves to do this, and continue to look at the way Indigenous people have managed the land, have relationships with the animals, have relationships with the waters and the fish, as a technology, because it's truly a sustainable way. It's sustainable for 17,000 years. I mean, how more sustainable do we want to get? And I think that if we just start giving power, in those statements back to Indigenous people, it opens the door for all of us and everyone listening to you to start thinking that way, because those Western romanticism, kind of falsehoods, they sort of make us believe that Alaska and these places that all of you work, were once these wild, untouched things, and that Native people were either not there or were just kind of like living as amongst them as part of it, right? As part of the floral and fauna, but really they were there caring for it. And part of their belief was about being in relationship, not necessarily being above it, that they were within it, and that they didn't own it. They were responsible for it and responsible towards it. So yeah, and I also want to say too, before we move on, is that, I'm kind of giving like a lot of credit to land acknowledgement, but it is just a gesture. Land acknowledgement is just words. It's not reconciliation. It's not reparations. Land acknowledgement is just words. But I do think that if you take a deeper look at the words, you take a deeper look as to why you want to be doing a land acknowledgement, it can help you strategize what your path forward is, and how you're going to use your land acknowledgement to challenge yourself, to always be learning. So, yeah, I saw some questions and stuff too, and I do this workshop, quite a bit. Feel free to take a screenshot, but I just ask that just as in land acknowledgement, that you credit sort of the work that I've done in that as well. So yeah, feel free to take a screenshot, and then also a lot of this information is in the guide that I created on my website, which is just my name, melissashaginoff.com. And if you go to the land acknowledgement workshop, you'll see a button for PDF. So, all right, keep going. Also I want to say too that this work, this is just my work. This is, I can't go and say that this is the exact right way to do it. This is just how I do land acknowledgement, and this is how I teach about land acknowledgement. And I've talked to my elders, talked to my tribe, and trying to do it the best way possible. But also, I'm always changing, and I'm always learning too. And what's right today or feels good today might be challenged tomorrow. But that's part of it. Like if we're working towards equity and change, it's an ongoing process, and we're never arriving at the exact right land acknowledgement or the exact right answer. It's just about taking the next step forward and doing your best in that moment, and then trying to take the next step and the next step and the next step. It's just up to you to continue that movement forward. and continue to ask yourself questions. So now I just want to share a little bit about within Alaska and sort of the cultural things that I've learned that I think are in line with land acknowledgement, and also some contextual things. I think when you learn these things about Indigenous cultures, Indigenous belief systems, that it can help us sort of kind of bridge the gap and start a relationship with each other, start an allegiance with each other, because I think ultimately our goals are similar. We want to live within this place. We want to care for it. And sometimes that means giving it over to Indigenous people. Sometimes that means, handing over the power and privilege, to Indigenous people, because we've been doing it for so long, and that doesn't mean necessarily like taking away something from you or from your organization. It means about starting a cycle of reciprocity between the two, and that's truly an Indigenous way of being. It's about kind of giving away what you have, with the hope that you'll get it back. And in Indigenous ways, you will. Indigenous potlatch, Indigenous ceremony, Indigenous beliefs of morality, you'll get those things back. Kind of like karma, to simplify it. But of course, it involves much more, specific things, talking specifically about Alaska. So I started off this presentation saying Nay'dini'aa Na Kayax, which means I'm responsible for Chickaloon Village. I'm responsible for the log of the river, and I said when I was starting to learn my language, introductions were the first thing I learned, and I never really understood that, as a young person. But as I've gotten older, I realized that it's because you're kind of leading with you're leading with who you're accountable towards. You're leading with, I'm coming and I'm going to come into this place and introduce myself. But you know what? Here's where I'm accountable towards. Here's what I'm responsible for. And part of my carefulness, part of my respect that I'm offering is because I hold that on my shoulders, and I hold that with me. And I have to also honor that, I think that we think so individually, in the modern world that, when we mess up, it's just our mess up, but the way I was raised and how I believe is that, that you're the work that you do, you're responsible not only just towards yourself, you're responsible towards your whole community. You bring that community with you and you're representing them. So you need to be thinking, what's the best way I can introduce myself? What's the best way I can offer respect when I go into a place that's not my own? And because it's a culturally appropriate thing to know someone. And, that was something that I learned from my chief in Chickaloon, Gary Harrison. I learned that when he was quite young, in his early 20s, he became chief. And it's because he would drive up and down Ahtna territory, that deep red part in the map you see. Drive up and down that road, up and down, and he knew everybody's house, knew where he could stop to get some tea, knew where what elder might need fish, knew where he could, get his tire changed. And again, as a young person, I didn't understand why that made him chief, like why that was so important. But then I realized that it's the importance of knowing people, because Indigenous leadership, Indigenous belief systems, are really about being a good person. And you're a leader and considered a wealthy person if you have the ability to care for a lot of people. And that ability includes knowing what their needs are, knowing what ways they can contribute to the community. And that knowledge is looked at as power. It's looked at as being that good person. And if you're that good person, honoring the natural world revolves around being grateful. If you're that good person who's being grateful, the animals, the plants, the waters, the fish, they're going to give themselves to you. They're going to offer themselves to you because you're walking through the world in the best way possible, and they know you, they know your soul. And if you're doing that kind of work, you're going to be gifted. And then that starts that cycle of reciprocity, that cycle of sharing. You're being gifted, so you have to be a good person. And then you gift that to your community. And then you're gifted again, and you're a good person. and then you give that to your community. And, I share this, because I think that it's a really good thing. It's a really good thing to try to hold on to, and also, realize about Indigenous people, realize about Indigenous cultures. And I don't want to talk to every Indigenous culture. I can really only talk for my own. But I will say that, this is a belief that I've heard from many cultures, that I'm in community with, Indigenous cultures. So I think it's just something to keep in mind. And again, these moments too that I'm sharing, they're very special to me and special to my culture. So I just want to, make sure too that whatever you share after this, that it's also credited to the Ahtna people and credit to myself. Sorry to keep reminding you, but at the same time, it's just important to offer protection for yourself as well too. And I think land acknowledgement also offers the opportunity, to learn these things, right? Because when you take a deeper dive and start interrogating your own beliefs and own knowledge of Indigenous people, of the Indigenous land that you're on, I think it connects you, to both a global community and a local community, of Indigenous people. So, yeah, we'll keep going. All right, so this is kind of the big ask that I have for you all. I want you to answer one of these 3 questions, for yourself, but then also, please put them in the chat, and hopefully we'll just get a couple of those questions. So Doug, I'll just, let you kind of choose whichever ones you're able to kind of put in there, or get in time, and we'll read them later on in the presentation. But here's the questions. And this is also something I think good for you to hold on to. Do I know who the Indigenous people are in the place I live or work? Do I know the work they do to care for this place? What ways can I acknowledge them? What work will I do to make sure they see and or hear it? What barriers or fears do I have in reaching out, thanking them, or outwardly supporting them in actions of reparations? So take a look at these questions. Think about them. Just give just a few seconds more. And if whoever feels inclined, please put it into the chat, and whichever ones come in first, I'm sure Doug will just grab and share later. So yeah, we're going to keep going. We're going to go ahead and actually skip over this video. This is I'll just kind of go through what it is. I just don't want to take up too much time with this, but yeah, this video is from the Toronto school system, and in schools every morning they start with the land acknowledgement. They teach students how to do land acknowledgements, and I think like the big takeaway that I get from this video is that actually this young person right in the corner is the last person to speak in the video, and they're like, leadership and the teachers, they're doing really good. They're doing land acknowledgements, and it's important, to know how to help communities and to learn about Indigenous people. But, they could be doing more. They could be doing better. And I don't mean that in a negative sense. I think that the fact that these young people are seeing their leaders and their teachers acknowledging Indigenous people, and they're taking it upon themselves to be critical of it, and upon themselves to think, actually, you could also do this. You could also be doing that. And I think that that's really kind of what I hope is sort of the snowball of land acknowledgement, right? Is that we're able to kind of get to a critical sort of tipping point and a threshold of, okay, we've heard land acknowledgements. How can we make it better? How can we be critical of it, accept correction, and move forward, right? And I think that, that in this work of equity, we just have to be prepared to do that. And these kids, they're such a good example of that, because it's really easy for young people to look at other people and say, yeah, you should be recognized for that. And so it always kind of chokes me up a little bit. But yeah, this video is really wonderful, and hopefully I'll be able to share that in another space. But yeah. So in moving forward, I think these are a few things that you can kind of ask yourself, and kind of like make sure that you're holding on to. Learn to accept correction without defensiveness. Realize that everyone's on their own journey of identity and healing. Start to map your personal path of reparation and equity. Expect to make mistakes, but do your best, and realize that the process of change is ongoing. And this is a really great resource. You see down there the little website that it's from. It's from Lucayo, who is an activist and an organizer, a really wonderful artist and teacher. And they, on their website, they kind of have a description of sort of where this resource came from. But it's kind of shared as like community knowledge. But I always want to recognize them because they truly kind of mapped out its sort of path to us, So claim, being called out or being called in. And this is when you're being corrected and somebody's calling you out, and how you can really kind of sit with that, And so here, I'm just going to read this through this, and then we'll kind of move on. But I think it's important. Center yourself. You're not being attacked. You're a good person. This is about your behavior and stopping harm to others. Listen. Don't interrupt or think of ways to defend yourself. Focus on learning what was harmful and being empathic/compassionate. Acknowledge/apologize. Instead of explaining what you did, acknowledge what happened and apologize, if needed or requested, for the harm that you caused. Inquire. If they consent and have time or resources, sorry, my window is being hidden from me. Time or resources, ask what you could have done instead, and how to make amends for what happened. The best apology is change behavior. If they gave you reasonable recommendations to make amends, do them. Don't do harm again, and use this experience to help others learn too. This is a really wonderful resource. If you go to this website at the bottom, you can find it. But it's also pretty widely shared over online, being called out, being called in. It's I think it's a good sort of rule of thumb for everyone, because if you sort of expect yourself, to make mistakes, but know that you're trying to move forward, it can kind of set you up for when you are corrected to not immediately have that defensiveness sort of reaction. So okay, we'll go ahead and keep going. I see a couple information or a couple questions that are coming in on the first questions, but we'll get to those in just one second. And these are just like some tips that I like to share with people that I think are helpful. They're helpful to me at least. So I like to consent to correction. So when I'm doing a land acknowledgement, of course, unless I'm here on my lands, I like to say, I just want to consent to correction. If I've misspoke, if I've mispronounced, if I've done anything that's offensive or incorrect, if you have like the time and space, please correct me, and I like to announce that in my land acknowledgements or in presentations that I'm doing, about the content, but specifically about land acknowledgements. And I think that's a good way to sort of set yourself up to even be ready to be corrected, so you can not have that knee-jerk reaction that feels like, oh, somebody's correcting you because you're bad, or because you've been offensive, or because you've done something, wrong in the sense that you've hurt people, right? And it's about sort of setting yourself up to be ready to be corrected. I also like to advise people to, write a letter to the local tribal council introducing yourself. Like I said, introductions are important. And so many people come to Alaska with a different context, right? And this is, particularly in Alaska, but all really Indigenous places. We've had people come in and remove us from our own lands, remove us from our culture, try to, take things from us. So coming in with your context of why you're there and what you're doing can help set up at least maybe the basis for a relationship and allegiance, or at least give the tribal council the choice in the matter, right? The choice to be in allegiance with you, the choice to be in relationship with you based on what you share in a humbleness, Also, I think it's important to find out the current work being done by the local tribe and how you can support them. Every tribe, is working on their own things. my tribe and Chickaloon is very concerned with the revitalization of Indigenous language, and they're very concerned with our school. We have the only tribal school, in Alaska that isn't funded. We fundraise every year for our school, and those are really easy, kind of plug-in ways for you to support us, monetarily, but also spreading that information is a way that you support people. It's important. Always offer compensation for labor. I think a lot of times we invite Native people in to do a land acknowledgement or a blessing, right? And a lot of that is uncompensated. And I think that it's kind of the impression that, oh, well, aren't you happy that we're doing it? And so you should just be doing it for free, and that's not fair, because not only is it just labor, it is also emotional labor. So build, this compensation into your budgets and expect to put it into your planning, for every event, because every event that you do should include Indigenous people, because particularly on the fish and wildlife, it's like you're managing these things that are ours, and that we've cared for thousands of years. Hopefully it's not too offensive. But also continue to perspective take, interrogate your own beliefs, think about ways that you might be biased, or that you might be holding on to, a belief that you can't quite shake, and really look at it, examine it, tease out kind of why you feel those things, and do that work yourself, right? Also remember to forgive yourself. We all start somewhere. But once we acknowledge our past, we're responsible for our future, so for everyone watching, right? It's like you have a lot of power and privilege just being here, taking in this information that I'm sharing, right? And again, I'm not always right, but at the same time, it's your responsibility to take what you've learned here, even if it's just one sentence that you've learned, one thing that you're pulling apart. It's your responsibility to share that. And to really perpetuate, those things, because that's truly sharing the burden of truth and sharing the history and the truth and just the knowledge, and it makes it so it's not only on my shoulders. This should be on all of our shoulders, particularly if we want to be allies, particularly if we want to be a community. And if that's what you believe, if that's something that you want for your community, for yourself, for your work, then that's up to you, share the burden of truth. All right. So now we're going to go back to those. Oh, wait, no, we have a cute little video.
Go. We acknowledge the Indigenous histories of this land, the Ciisquq people of the World Nation, past, present, and future. We touch the land, we reach up for scale, touch the land, and we touch our heart, we touch the land.
Yeah, I like to kind of end what I've said with that, because I know it can be kind of heavy sometimes, but this is what our future looks like if we do this work. And even though it's hard and we have a lot of questions and barriers and fears, we need to do this for our young people. We need to do this for our community, because they'll feel it like this young person in their body. It's just second nature, easy to say and easy to recognize the work of others and to acknowledge Indigenous people in that. So I see questions coming in, which I'm excited about to look at the answers. So we'll go back here. And I'm just going to kind of try to scroll through. Let's see. I apologize if I can't get to everyone. I see people talking about the Indigenous people. Oh, here's a question. I got one saying that if I'm afraid if I work too much on reparations, of being seen within the agency as being biased or too pro-Native. Oh, that's really sad. Pro-Native, I think, is just pro-people. I appreciate though your bluntness in saying it like that, because there is kind of this perspective in many workplaces, you know, that like, oh, well, if we give it all to Native people, or we're offering too many seats to Native people, then it's unbalanced. But the equity part of this work, equity is not equality. Equality is that everyone has an equal share of it. But equity is about realizing that some people, some groups have an imbalance of power in these spaces. And that right now, if we're trying to change and trying to shift that balance of power to be equal, that we have to be bringing in those marginalized communities first and foremost, because eventually we'll start to shift that narrative. We'll start to shift that power structure where it can be equal, you know. And I think that, you know, I hope that's not a phrase you've heard, being too pro-Native, because that's really sad if anybody has said that, because yeah, for many reasons. But yeah, so I think that if there's a way that you can kind of share with your organization what equity is, and really kind of what that means, it's about shifting power structures, and that takes time. You know, I sit on many, I sit on a public art committee, and we're talking about like the open seats and who it should go to, who should we invite, because it's an invite only kind of thing. And you know, the leader, you know, in sort of that group, the curator, you know, was I said, well, we should allot the 2 open seats to Indigenous people. And they're like, well, we have you, right? So we need to allot it to other groups, you know, or to other like, you know, professions, you know, or other people, you know. And I addressed it with him as being like, well, when you say that, I was like, you're looking at Indigenous cultures just in Alaska as a monolith. You know, you're looking at us as one people. When you say Native, you're saying one people, you know. And the truth is, you know, we're all very unique and different, and that we come from different community perspectives. And me just being here is only an Ahtna perspective, because I'm only an Ahtna person. I'm a Paiute person too, but speaking about Alaska, you know, I'm only an Ahtna person, and I only represent that. You need to have other groups of Indigenous people represented in that, you know, and that I can't represent one culture. And I would say the same for you, that, you know, whatever sort of work that you're doing with one community doesn't represent all the Natives people, doesn't represent all Indigenous Alaska or all Indigenous wherever you're coming in from. So yeah, I would just try to explain equity to those sort of criticisms of being too pro-Native. And you know, good luck. And I appreciate the work that you're doing, you know, on reparations. That's so important, and it means a lot to Native people and to Native communities. So thank you. So I got another one.
Melissa, this is Crystal. I'm wondering
Hello.
if you can unshare your screen and have Jen maybe moderate the questions.
Okay, yeah, that would be great. Let me stop sharing. Okay.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Crystal. Thank you, Melissa. That was super informational, and we appreciate you sharing from your heart. We do have a couple of questions that have come in. The first one is, what happens when you have a tribal member who is against land acknowledgement? They view it as a reminder of historic trauma and broken promises and treaties.
Yeah, land acknowledgements can totally be hollow, and they can feel really hurtful, right? Particularly when they are memorized, when they don't come from a personal place, which is why I advise people to do land acknowledgements that come from your personal work, you know, that come from your sort of personal sort of understanding, you know. And I would, you know, if somebody is expressing that to you, ask them if you can have more of a conversation with them, you know, and maybe pose it as like, well, what ways could we acknowledge those things? You know, what if my land acknowledgement was, you know, I'm here on, I'll just use my term, I'm here on Ahtna land that is, you know, that has a Ahtna land where the Ahtna people have experienced broken treaties. They've experienced land displacement. They've experienced genocide. You know, I think sometimes those moments, it's about speaking truth to power, right? And I think that land acknowledgements can feel really hollow and harmful when those histories aren't recognized, you know? And again, I have to reiterate and say too that everyone is on their own path of healing and identity, you know? And for some, they're still going through that trauma. And for some, they're still holding on to that history, you know, because there's been many microaggressions against them, you know? And part of your work to be done, because you're trying to be in relationship with Indigenous people, including that person, is about talking to them, asking them, you know, what is the appropriate way for me to address these things, if they have time and space and if they consent to that.
Yeah, thank you, Melissa. I'll add to that too. This reminds me of a question I got via email before the broadcast about what is the difference between an individual land acknowledgement and an acknowledgement from a field station point of view. And I think it's important to know and remember that as a federal agency, we have a government-to-government relationship with tribes. So if a field station is going to make a land acknowledgement, like a written land acknowledgement on a permanent display or on a website or in social media, really that land acknowledgement should be consulted on with the tribal government that's nearest to you or whose traditional homelands the field station is located on. It's a different level of relationship. It's a really high level relationship that requires maybe uncovering some uncomfortable truths from history and acknowledging those truths and repairing through healing and conversation. And then the tribal council really is the authority of the tribe. So you can, again, what Melissa said is spot on, have individual conversations with the tribal member. But it's a different relationship if you're talking about a field station having a land acknowledgement.
Absolutely. I also want to add to that as well, like the difference between personal and institutional land acknowledgements, right? I think like institutional land acknowledgements, it needs to be done in a group, and it needs to be done in a way that, again, is consulting with individuals, right? Because those things come out of being like, well, we want your station to acknowledge this, right? And I also think that there's a way to sort of turn it into a living document and maybe announce, or at least within that group, recognize that that this is going to be changing, you know, as our communities and our knowledge changes, right? So today, this is what our land acknowledgement is, and that we've been informed and have been in agreement and in an equitable, you know, relationship with the Indigenous people. But tomorrow it might be different because they ask us to change it, and you have to be ready to make that change and ready to adjust, because that's part of the relationship. You know, it's part of not sort of reaching a land acknowledgement, you know, for your institution that is perfect, right? Because I don't think there really is a perfect one. It's all should be changing as your knowledge changes and shifts.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you for that. We have time for one more quick question before we need to wrap up for today. This has been super informative, but the question just came in. Should the federal government be compensating tribes for consultation?
Absolutely. Right? I mean, Yes. I mean, they should be compensating them for consulting work. It may be a government to government relationship, but it's also an equitable relationship. And that's something we have to recognize what the power structures are. And then also, just like you would consult a scientist or a biologist to, take samples for something, to work on your management, just like you consult with outside firms, outside researchers and academics. You're consulting with people, and it's not this sort of like ethereal thing. Tribes, people, they all need to be compensated for their time and work.
Yeah, and I'll add, I know that we have our Department of Interior tribal consultation policies and Fish and Wildlife Service guidance through our Native American policy. They don't talk about compensation. That it touches on it a bit, but what Melissa is talking about is when tribal experts, elders, or hunters, gatherers, people who have traditional knowledge are providing that knowledge to us. It's like we are paying a scientific researcher for the time they're spending research, their lab time, all the kinds of travel and data gathering that they've done. And so it is important that if we're getting knowledge for our purposes, that we do compensate them for that.
And I just think it's kind of an important thing to say too, that, Indigenous people, with whatever sort of knowledge that they have, every person is not born with that knowledge. You're not born knowing these things. You're not born knowing how to care for the land, to understand these sort of deep knowledge things. They're hard won, and they are incredibly researched, incredibly, resilient, and keeping that and being able to do that alongside also the Western education, that we're our history and our knowledge is all self-education, and it's all been a lot of work for Indigenous people to do on their own. So everyone you're talking to did not have a privilege. They had to really work for that. And that's what you're paying for. You're paying for their hard-won and hard-kept knowledge.
Thank you. Thank you both, Crystal and Melissa, for sharing your knowledge with us today. We really appreciate your time. As a reminder, NCTC will continue hosting the Tribal Broadcast Series on the third Thursday of each month. And we'll have a follow-up to this broadcast. It's called Growing from Land Acknowledgements, which will be held on Thursday, October 21st at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Each broadcast is recorded and available on NCTC's website. If you wish to learn more about future broadcasts or be added to the listserv, please email me. It's Jennifer Hill at Jennifer_Hill@fws.gov. And I want to thank everybody for joining us today, and remind folks that if you need further information from Crystal or Melissa, their contact information is on the screen, as well as a link to the Legacy Region 5 SharePoint site, which has information about land acknowledgements. And we just, again, want to give our deepest thanks to Crystal and Melissa for their time today. So thank you all for joining.
Yeah, Chinan, everyone. I really appreciate people listening in.
Cleana.